On his birthday, Richard was abandoned at a restaurant by his own son, David, but the real knife to the heart came when a security guard leaned in and whispered, "I saw him pour something into your juice." The words sliced through the air like a blade, turning a simple glass of orange liquid into a loaded weapon. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night raising David now twisted into a nightmare no parent should face. Betrayal didn't just knock at the door, it sat at his table. Subscribe now and comment where you're watching from, because what Richard uncovered next will leave you breathless. The restaurant still smelled of roasted garlic and warm bread, but to Richard the air felt like ice pressing against his chest. He sat alone at a round table for four, a single candle flickering in the center like a cruel joke. The seat across from him was empty, its napkin folded neatly as if mocking him with the absence of the one person he had hoped would stay. His son David had risen only minutes before, brushing crumbs from his jacket, mumbling something about urgent business and leaving behind nothing but a faint scent of his cologne and a silence sharp enough to cut through bone. Richard tried to swallow the lump forming in his throat, but it lodged there unmoving. He remembered how birthdays used to feel when Linda was alive, when the house filled with the laughter of neighbors, when David would burst through the front door with drawings clutched in small hands and a voice eager to sing off-key, "Happy Birthday." Now the only music was the scrape of cutlery from strangers' tables and the dull thud of his own heartbeat, reminding him he was still here, still waiting, still unwanted. The waiter approached with an awkward smile, balancing a slice of cake dressed in chocolate drizzle and a thin candle glowing against the dim lights. "Happy birthday, sir," the young man offered, but Richard could hear the hollowness in the words. He forced a nod, lifted the fork, and felt the sweetness dissolve bitter on his tongue. Each bite was heavier than the last, each chew echoing like an accusation. You raised him, you gave him everything, and still he left. The chair opposite stayed empty, a shadow at his table, and the restaurant's warmth could not chase the cold gnawing its way into his bones. His eyes drifted toward the window where the night pressed against the glass. Neon signs flickered across puddles left from the afternoon rain, and in the reflection he caught his own face, lined, weary, older than he had admitted to himself in the mirror that morning. He saw a man who had worked double shifts, who had paid for college tuition without complaint, who had swallowed pride again and again just to keep his son's world intact. And yet here he sat, reduced to a silent figure in a corner, another old man nursing coffee that had gone lukewarm while his son walked away without looking back. The sting of abandonment was worse than the sharpest winter wind. He clenched his hands beneath the table, the veins rising against the skin, trying to steady himself. But the memory of the security guard's whisper still echoed in his mind. The words were impossible to forget. "I saw him pour something into your juice." He glanced at the glass, still half full, the condensation trickling down its side like beads of sweat. The orange color no longer looked bright, no longer looked safe. It sat there like a loaded gun, ordinary in appearance, deadly in implication. He imagined the moment David had leaned over, casual and unsuspecting, slipping something into the liquid while pretending to be a dutiful son. The thought clawed at Richard's chest until his breath came shallow, ragged. But what cut deepest was not the suspicion of poison. It was the indifference, the ease with which his only child had left him alone in a crowded room as if he were a stranger. Richard shifted in his seat, the leather creaking beneath his weight, and watched other families around him clink glasses, share laughter, argue over dessert. He saw daughters leaning on their father's shoulders, sons refilling wine for their mothers, grandchildren tugging at sleeves with wide-eyed excitement. The sight hollowed him out further, as if the universe had staged this cruel theater just to remind him of everything he had lost. The candle in the middle of the cake sputtered out, leaving a thin trail of smoke that curled upward like a dying breath. Richard sat still, staring at it, unwilling to wave it away, letting the bitter smell cling to the air between him and the untouched glass. His throat tightened again, but this time he refused to blink. He refused to let tears give David the satisfaction of reducing him to weakness. The waiter returned to clear the plate. "Will anyone else be joining you, sir?" The words landed like a blow to the gut. Richard shook his head slowly, forcing the corners of his mouth upward into something resembling composure. "No," he answered, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the young man into a respectful retreat. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The restaurant grew louder as more guests arrived, filling tables with chatter and clinking cutlery. But around Richard the noise blurred into a low hum, muffled and distant, like he was sealed inside a glass box. He could feel the isolation pressing in tighter with each passing second. His eyes went again to the empty chair across from him, the seat that should have held his son, and he wondered how love could curdle into such cruel neglect. Memories of sacrifices bled into his mind, nights he had walked home from the factory with calloused hands, paychecks handed over for tuition, promises whispered to Linda that their boy would never know hunger or cold. All of it replayed now like a cruel montage against the backdrop of the present. An old man eating cake alone, dismissed as nothing more than an afterthought. The coldness in his chest deepened, not the kind that blankets you in sadness, but the kind that sharpens into something else, resolve, maybe even steel. His eyes narrowed slightly, scanning the glass once more. If David truly had meant harm, if the guard's whisper carried truth, then this night was not merely a disappointment. It was a warning. Richard's pulse steadied, no longer frantic but slow and deliberate, like the ticking of a clock in an empty room. He knew then that this night, this betrayal, was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of something else, something David could not yet imagine. He rose from the table, leaving the juice untouched, his shadow stretching long across the polished floor. The night air outside wrapped around him as he stepped into the street, cooler than before, filled with the hum of traffic and the faint hiss of tires against wet asphalt. Richard inhaled deeply, letting the chill burn his lungs, and with each breath the weight of abandonment shifted into something colder, sharper. The empty chair, the poisoned glass, the son who had walked away, these were no longer just wounds. They were fuel. And as Richard walked into the night, his mind no longer lingered on what was lost. It turned toward what was coming. Because when a father is left alone on his birthday, stripped of trust and dignity, something awakens that cannot be silenced. And David, whether he realized it or not, had just ignited a storm he would never be able to control. What Richard did next would not only answer the betrayal, it would change everything. Richard sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the glass of orange juice that still rested on the table like an unspoken threat. The condensation had pooled into a ring on the linen, a pale halo that seemed to grow darker the longer he stared. Around him the restaurant carried on as if nothing had happened. Servers balancing trays of pasta and wine, laughter spilling from nearby tables. A pianist in the corner playing a tune so soft it almost mocked him. To anyone else it was an ordinary evening, but for Richard the world had shifted into something hostile, unfamiliar. His pulse drummed against his ribs, steady at first, then quicker, as though urging him to act. The guard's words replayed in his mind with cruel clarity. "I saw him pour something into your juice." He tried to dismiss it as a mistake, a misunderstanding born of shadows and paranoia. But the evidence sat right in front of him, glowing a sickly shade of orange beneath the dim lights. He could feel his throat tighten as if the drink itself had already poisoned him, though he hadn't touched a drop. His hand twitched toward the glass, then pulled back just as quickly, fingers curling into a fist. Every instinct screamed at him to leave it untouched, but his curiosity gnawed at the edges of his fear. He leaned back in his chair, scanning the room. The waiter moved between tables with rehearsed efficiency. A couple argued quietly over a bottle of wine, and near the bar a group of young men toasted with loud, careless laughter. None of them knew the storm unraveling inside the old man seated alone by the window. Richard felt the sweat gather at his temples despite the cool air conditioning. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and the room seemed to close in tighter with each breath he took. A memory surged, uninvited David as a boy standing on a chair to reach the kitchen counter, insisting on pouring juice for his father. Back then, his clumsy hands had spilled more than they served, but his laughter had been pure, untainted by greed or bitterness. Richard remembered drinking every drop, no matter how watery or warm, because it had been given with love. Now that same act, the simple pouring of juice, felt like betrayal dressed in familiarity. How had they arrived here from innocence to suspicion so sharp it cut through decades of sacrifice? The unease burrowed deeper. Richard began to question everything. Why had David chosen this restaurant? Why had he insisted on sitting near the back, away from the bustle of the main floor? Why leave so abruptly, mumbling about urgent business without even a backward glance? Each detail that had seemed trivial earlier now carried weight, pulling him down into a darker realization. He wasn't just alone on his birthday. He was the mark of something far more sinister. His gaze dropped again to the juice. He studied the surface, searching for signs, an odd shimmer, a powder dissolving something to confirm what he already feared. The candlelight reflected in the glass, fractured and distorted, giving the liquid an almost metallic sheen. He pushed the drink slightly with his fingertips, watching the ripples spread and fade. For a fleeting second, he imagined lifting it to his lips just to know the truth, to feel whether the guard's warning was fantasy or fate. But the thought of collapsing onto the tiled floor while the restaurant carried on, oblivious, sent a shiver through him so sharp he gripped the table to steady himself. The air around him thickened, heavy with possibility. His ears picked up every sound, the squeak of a cart's wheel from the kitchen, the clink of a fork against a plate, the faint hum of the pianist shifting into a minor key. It was as if the universe itself had tuned to his dread, amplifying every note of his unease. He imagined David's face, the way his son's eyes had hardened over the years, distant and calculating. That same face, once lit with boyish mischief, now seemed capable of shadows Richard had never allowed himself to consider until tonight. He adjusted his jacket, the fabric sticking to his back with sweat. The decision before him loomed larger than any he had faced in his life. Not whether to drink, that answer was clear, but whether to confront the truth. To acknowledge that his son might have looked at his father not as blood, not as family, but as an obstacle to be removed. That possibility was more suffocating than poison. The juice remained untouched, but its presence was louder than the chatter of the entire restaurant. Richard slid it further across the table, out of reach, though even then he felt its pull. He thought about leaving, standing up, walking out into the cool night, and never looking back. But he couldn't, not yet. To flee without answers was to surrender, and Richard had never been a man who surrendered easily. He had worked his whole life to hold the ground beneath his feet, to build a future for the very boy who now might be plotting against him. He wiped his palms on the tablecloth, his breathing slow, deliberate. His eyes narrowed, and a spark of something colder than fear flickered in his chest. He wasn't ready to act, not tonight, not in this crowded place. But he knew with certainty that he couldn't let this moment pass unmarked. The truth demanded pursuit, and he would find it not by drinking from that glass, but by turning suspicion into knowledge. The restaurant's lights seemed to dim as he stood sliding a few bills onto the table without waiting for the check. He left the glass untouched, glowing faintly behind him like a relic of betrayal. Each step toward the exit felt deliberate, heavy, as if he were crossing into another life, one where innocence had burned away, leaving only vigilance. The guard's eyes met his from across the room, a silent nod passing between them. Richard understood now this was not the end of the night, but the beginning of a darker path. As the door swung open, and the night air rushed in cool against his damp skin, Richard knew the unease would not leave him. It had taken root, spreading through his veins, stronger than any poison. What had been a simple birthday dinner had transformed into something far more dangerous, and with each step into the shadows outside, he could feel the weight of revelation closing in. Because if a father could no longer trust his only son, then what came next would not be a matter of survival alone. It would be a reckoning. And Richard, with the cold determination tightening in his chest, was already preparing for it. The words of the guard didn't fade. They carved themselves into Richard's mind, etched deeper with every heartbeat. He had walked out of the restaurant, leaving the poisoned glass behind, but the warning followed him into the night. The street buzzed with the ordinary hum of traffic, neon signs flickering against wet pavement. But for him the world tilted angles sharper, shadows darker. Nothing felt stable anymore. Each sound carried menace. Each glance from a stranger seemed too knowing. What had been a simple birthday dinner hours ago had turned into a crucible, and the words of that young guard echoed louder than the city itself. I saw him pour something into your juice. Richard replayed the moment with merciless clarity. The guard's eyes hadn't shifted with doubt. His voice hadn't wavered. He had spoken with the quiet certainty of someone who had witnessed betrayal in its rawest form. Yet disbelief clung to Richard like a desperate hand. David was his son, his blood, his. Could those hands, once small enough to clutch his finger, now be capable of such malice? Could the boy, who once begged for bedtime stories, now plot to erase the very man who carried him on his shoulders? The questions pressed against his skull, each one heavier than the last. Memory surged unbidden. The late nights when David would slam the door after arguments, his voice sharp with contempt. The dinners where silence stretched across the table like a gulf too wide to cross. The excuses, the clipped tones, the avoidance of eye contact. It hadn't been sudden. The distance had grown slowly, layer upon layer, until Richard barely recognized the man his son had become. But until tonight he had clung to the illusion that beneath the hardness there was still loyalty, still love. Now that illusion shattered, jagged shards cutting through his chest with every recollection. He walked without direction, his shoes striking the slick pavement, carrying him past shuttered shops and dim street lamps that flickered like dying stars. The city felt foreign, hostile each corner, a reminder of how small one man could feel when the ground beneath him had given way. He found himself stopping before a shop window, his reflection staring back at him. The man in the glass looked like a stranger. Hollow eyes, mouth set in a grim line, shoulders slumped under invisible weight. Behind those eyes swirled disbelief, but also something sharper, something dangerous, the spark of suspicion. Richard pressed his palm against the cold glass, trying to steady his breath. If the guard was right, then tonight had not been an accident. Tonight had been orchestrated. And if it had been orchestrated, then what else had been plotted? Was this the first attempt, or merely the first one he had noticed? A chill ran down his spine at the thought. How many times had he trusted meals placed in front of him, drinks poured without question, rides offered with forced smiles, each memory now twisted, laced with dread. He thought of Linda, his late wife, and how she used to warn him about blind devotion. She had seen things in David he had refused to acknowledge, subtle shades of selfishness, entitlement hidden behind youthful arrogance. Don't shield him from consequences forever, she had said more than once, her voice laced with worry. Richard had waved her off, believing discipline would only harden their son further. He had chosen leniency over confrontation, love over judgment. And now, in the darkened street, her warnings rose from the grave, sharper than ever. The guard's voice returned, layered now with Linda's, a chorus of truths he had ignored. His chest tightened, breath shallow. He leaned against the cold brick wall of a building, feeling the tremor in his hands. Fear slid through him. Not the kind that makes a man run, but the kind that roots him in place, forcing him to face the abyss yawning at his feet. If he admitted this possibility that his son wanted him gone, then nothing about his world was safe. Not his home, not his routine, not even his memories. And yet, beneath the fear, suspicion bloomed into something darker. His mind began to search for patterns connecting dots he had overlooked. The sudden interest David had shown in his finances, the casual questions about the deed to the house, the unexplained visits from lawyers whose cards Richard had found tossed in the trash. The urgency to sell, the pressure to downsize, the manipulative assurances that it was all for the best. It had felt like nagging before. Now, under the weight of the guard's words, it felt like strategy. The night deepened around him, silence pressing in, but Richard's thoughts only grew louder. He could almost see David's face calm, practice the mask of a man who believed himself clever enough to outwit his own father. But had he miscalculated? Did he think Richard too old, too blind, too trusting to notice? Rage flickered at the edge of his fear, and with it resolve began to take shape. He pulled his coat tighter, the city wind biting through the fabric, and turned toward home. Every step felt deliberate, measured as if he were already moving along a path laid out by fate. He would not confront David, not yet. Recklessness was David's weapon, not his. Richard's strength had always been patience, calculation, the slow turning of gears until inevitability ground down anything in its way. Inside him, disbelief battled with dread, but one thing had become undeniable. The guard's warning had torn the veil from his eyes, and now he could see the edges of a truth he wasn't ready to face, but couldn't escape. If his son was willing to poison a glass of juice, then what waited beyond that glass could be far worse. And as Richard stepped into the night silence, the question burned hotter than the fear itself. What else had David already set in motion, and how much time was left before the next move struck Richard's steps, echoed hollow on the pavement as he walked deeper into the night, each one dragging a weight heavier than the last. The guard's words lingered, but it was not just the warning that gnawed at him, it was what the warning forced him to confront. Trust, the very foundation of his life as a father, was cracking beneath his feet. For years he had told himself that blood was thicker than disappointment, that no matter how strained their relationship became, his son could never betray him completely. Now, staring into the possibility that David had tried to harm him, those convictions felt like glass splintering in his hands. Memories rose like ghosts in the shadows of the street. Richard could still see the small boy who had once run barefoot across their backyard, grass stains on his knees and laughter spilling into the summer air. He could still feel the tug of a small hand gripping his as they crossed the street, the whispered, "Don't let go, Dad." He had promised himself then that he never would. Years of double shifts, years of missed dinners and aching bones had been endured so that promise could stand. And yet here he was, left with the thought that the son he protected might have been the one tightening the noose around his neck. The bitterness was a taste he couldn't spit out. Every sacrifice now replayed with a cruel twist. The tuition payments that left him eating canned soup, the overtime that robbed him of rest, the quiet humiliation of begging for extensions on bills, so David could have opportunities he himself had never known. All of it suddenly felt less like love and more like a long con. The sense of betrayal was not in the money lost, but in the love, invested love, that now seemed unreciprocated, maybe even weaponized. The loss of trust carried with it a loneliness deeper than any he had known. The world could turn its back, and he would have stood tall, but when the betrayal came from within his own bloodline, it hollowed him out. He thought of Linda gone too soon, and how she had warned him not to coddle their son too much, how she had sensed the selfishness budding in him. Richard had silenced her warnings with the optimism only a father could carry. Now, with her gone and the echo of her caution ringing louder than ever, the regret cut through him like glass under skin. He paused beneath a flickering streetlight, his breath clouding in the cold air. The city around him seemed indifferent, its heartbeat steady, uncaring of the turmoil inside one solitary man. But Richard felt the chasm widening, the cruel truth that trust once lost can never be rebuilt. He thought of how easily David had left the table, how casually he had abandoned his father on his birthday. That in itself had been enough to wound. But the possibility that he had left behind not just neglect but danger in the form of that untouched glass was a cruelty almost beyond comprehension. For the first time, Richard felt something inside him die. Not hope, not yet, but something more primal: faith. The faith that blood ties were sacred. The faith that a father's love guaranteed loyalty. That faith collapsed into ash, leaving only the smoldering remains of obligation twisted into resentment. His chest tightened with a pain that was not physical, though it burned as if it were. He wanted to deny it, to cling to some shred of belief that this was all a mistake, that the guard had misinterpreted a harmless gesture. But the years of distance, the hardened look in David's eyes, the endless demands about the house and the finances, they formed a pattern too precise to ignore. If trust was a rope binding father and son, Richard now saw it fraying thread by thread until only a thin strand remained, one pull away from snapping. He thought back to the nights he had sat at the kitchen table, bills spread out like a battlefield, exhaustion dragging at his bones, telling himself it was worth it, because David's future depended on it. He had been the shield, the provider, the constant presence, even when he wanted to vanish from the crushing weight of responsibility. Now those years replayed not as noble acts of love, but as steps toward his own undoing, because the very future he had built seemed to be turning against him. The ache in his chest sharpened into something colder. He realized that even if David had not poisoned that glass, the seed of betrayal had already been planted. The trust had already rotted. That loss was irreversible. What father could look at his son the same way after tonight? What father could ever again share a meal without suspicion, a laugh without searching for malice beneath it? As he continued down the empty street, Richard's face hardened, the sorrow in his eyes cooling into a resolve he had never known. Pain had stripped him bare, peeled away every illusion until only truth remained jagged and merciless. He no longer felt the weight of disbelief. He felt the sting of reality. His son, the boy he had raised, might now be the man plotting his downfall. That realization was not just painful, it was transformative. The night seemed to whisper around him, carrying fragments of the past like cruel reminders. His son's first bike, the scraped knees, the proud smile at graduation, all of it blurred into a haze now overshadowed by the thought of that untouched glass. Richard clenched his fists, the veins on his hands standing out like rivers carved deep with time. He would not forget this night, nor forgive it. Somewhere deep inside, beyond the pain and the bitterness, something darker began to stir. He no longer longed for explanations or apologies. He no longer sought reconciliation. What grew in him now was colder, sharper, the certainty that if trust had been destroyed, then only action remained. He turned a corner, his shadow stretching long under the dim glow of another flickering lamp. The bitterness had carved out a hollow inside him, but in that hollow something else began to take root. He could not change the past nor resurrect the faith that had died tonight. But he could decide what came next. And as Richard disappeared into the silence of the night, his mind no longer lingered on the sacrifices of yesterday. It moved forward sharper and harder toward the choices of tomorrow. Choices that would demand more than endurance. Choices that would decide not only how he survived his son's betrayal, but how he answered it. The thought struck him with the force of a blade driven straight into the chest. If the guard's words were true, then his own flesh and blood had marked him for harm. Not a stranger in a dark alley, not an enemy from the past, but his only son, the boy he had carried on his shoulders, the young man whose future he had carved out of his own bones. The betrayal was too vast to fit neatly inside his mind, too sharp to dull itself against reason. It tore at him savage and merciless until every breath felt like it scraped against raw wounds. Richard moved through the city like a man both hunted and hunting rage, clashing with disbelief in a storm that gave him no peace. He thought of the empty chair at the restaurant table, the glass of juice glistening like a silent assassin, and the casual way David had walked out as though leaving his father to vanish into thin air. It was not just abandonment, it was contempt. It was cruelty wearing the mask of indifference. And on his birthday, the day that should have been a reminder of love and gratitude, it had become a death sentence disguised in citrus and ice. He clenched his jaw until the muscles ached, the heat of fury burning away the last remnants of denial. Memories came sharp and merciless. The boy clutching his hand at a carnival, the teenager begging for money with empty promises of payback. The young man standing in a cap and gown, his father's chest swelling with pride, even as he wondered if his son truly cared. Each memory now twisted into mockery, a parade of illusions that ended here in betrayal. The pride had been misplaced. The devotion had been wasted. And now it seemed the love had been weaponized against him. Richard's fists tightened at his sides, nails pressing crescents into his palms. He had endured disappointment before, but this was something else, something unholy. Betrayal by blood was a wound deeper than any knife could cut, because it split not just the present, but the past. It forced him to question whether love had ever been real, or if it had only been a story he told himself to justify the sacrifices that consumed his life. That realization struck harder than the poison ever could have. The night around him seemed to change shape, the buildings leaning closer, the shadows thicker, as though the world itself recoiled at the enormity of the act. He walked faster, the anger in his veins driving his legs forward, yet every step was weighted with the gravity of what he now carried. His heart thudded against his ribs, not with fear, but with a fury so potent it felt volcanic, ready to erupt. He could not shake the image of David leaning over that glass, slipping something into it with the same ease he might stir sugar into coffee. The thought replayed in his mind like a reel of film, burning itself across his vision, relentless and unforgiving. Richard remembered birthdays, past gifts, chosen with care, laughter filling their modest home. Linda's gentle smile as she watched father and son unwrap life together. To think that all of it could culminate in this moment, this night, was unbearable. It was not just betrayal, it was desecration. A desecration of love, of memory, of trust. The fury deepened, coiling tight around his chest until it was no longer grief, but something sharper, colder. His heart, pierced though it felt, refused to collapse. Instead, it hardened. Each beat was a vow, each pulse a declaration. If his own son had thought him weak, had thought him blind, had thought him disposable, then David had gravely misjudged the man he had tried to erase. Richard turned into a narrow alley, the street lamp buzzing faintly above him. His breath rose in the cold air, and for the first time since the guard's warning, he spoke aloud, his voice low, steady, dangerous. "My own son." He said the words bitter on his tongue. Saying it gave it weight, carved it into reality. The betrayal was no longer suspicion. It was truth, and that truth demanded an answer. He leaned against the wall, the rough brick biting into his shoulder, and closed his eyes for a moment. Behind his eyelids, images collided: David as a child calling him Dad. David as a man walking away without looking back. David's hand over that glass. The contrast was unbearable. But within that unbearable weight grew resolve. Pain had forged it, betrayal had sharpened it, and now it gleamed in his mind like steel drawn from the fire. When he opened his eyes again, the world seemed clearer. The street stretched ahead like a map of choices, each turn leading him further from the father he had been, and closer to the man he was becoming. The man who would no longer beg for loyalty, no longer hope for gratitude. The man who would not wait for justice to come, but would carve it himself, one deliberate stroke at a time. His pulse steadied anger, crystallizing into something lethal, a clarity that cut through the haze of grief. Betrayal had rewritten the story of his life, and he would not let the ending be dictated by a poisoned glass. His son had underestimated him, and that underestimation was about to become the most dangerous mistake of David's life. As Richard stepped back into the night, the city's heartbeat throbbed in the distance, indifferent to the storm rising inside him. The betrayal had carved him open, but in the hollow it left behind something new had taken root. Not forgiveness, not hope. Something far more relentless. And with every step forward, the question grew sharper, demanding its answer if his own son had already tried to end him once. How far would David go the next time? The image of that glass would not leave him. Even as Richard walked further into the night, past flickering neon and the hiss of wet tires on asphalt, it followed like a shadow he could not shake. The orange liquid glowed in his memory, bright and harmless to anyone else, but to him, it had transformed into a silent enemy waiting with patient cruelty. He could almost feel it staring back, daring him to drink, daring him to surrender. His throat tightened as if the poison had already burned its way down, though his lips had never touched it. The fear came in waves, unexpected and suffocating. He was not a man easily shaken. Years of labor and hardship had toughened his skin and steadied his nerves. But this fear was different. It was intimate. It was betrayal distilled into a glass, betrayal dressed up as refreshment, betrayal disguised as care. The thought that his own son might have laced it turned his stomach inside out. It was no longer just a drink. It was the face of treachery, silent and merciless. Richard stopped at the edge of a quiet intersection, leaning against a lamppost that buzzed weakly above him. His breath fogged in the cool air, uneven, jagged, every inhale catching in his chest like broken glass. His hands trembled despite himself. He clenched them into fists, trying to disguise the shake, but the tremor ran deeper than muscles. It was lodged in his bones, rooted in the knowledge that danger had been sitting inches from his hand while he celebrated what should have been another year of life. The memory sharpened until he could see the condensation sliding down the side of the glass, pooling into a ring on the tablecloth. He remembered the faint clink when he'd nudged it aside, the way the light fractured through the liquid, making it shimmer. That shimmer haunted him now. It was as if the drink itself had been alive, waiting. He imagined lifting it, feeling the cold rim against his lips, and in that instant the fear spiked so violently he pressed his palm against the brick wall beside him, grounding himself against the surge. The city around him blurred. He didn't see the cars passing or the couples hurrying across crosswalks. He saw only the glass. It had become a symbol larger than itself, an object that carried not just poison, but the weight of every doubt, every suspicion, every fracture in his bond with David. He had raised his son to be better, to hold values stronger than greed, to know the difference between love and exploitation. But the glass said otherwise. The glass whispered that he had failed, that the boy he had once cradled could now set traps for him, as if he were nothing more than an obstacle. Fear pressed down harder, a hand squeezing around his throat, invisible but relentless. His breaths shortened, shallow, each one an effort. He imagined himself back in that restaurant, slumped forward across the table, while the candle flickered down to smoke his body, a silent casualty no one would question. He imagined David receiving the call, his voice rehearsed with just enough grief to be convincing, his hands already reaching for papers, deeds, bank accounts. The thought made Richard's stomach churn. He tried to walk to shake the images loose, but they clung tighter with each step. The orange glow of streetlights reflected in puddles, and every glint looked like the liquid in that glass following him, reminding him of the fragility of his body, the fragility of trust. He pulled his coat tighter, but the chill was inside him, not outside. The kind of chill that came when you realized danger wasn't out there in the streets. It was inside the people you loved, people you thought would die for you, not try to kill you. Richard stopped again, this time near a closed shop front, the metal shutter reflecting his distorted image. He barely recognized the man staring back. His eyes were wide, restless, haunted. His lips were pressed thin, his face pale under the harsh glow of the streetlight. He looked like a man who had survived an attempt on his life, not because of strength, but because of chance. That realization twisted the fear deeper. If not for the guard, if not for that whispered warning, would tonight have been his last? Would he have drunk it all? Ignorant, trusting a fool, celebrating his birthday, while his son watched from a distance. His chest tightened again, this time sharper, as if invisible fingers clawed at his lungs. He forced himself to breathe slow, steady, but each inhale carried the phantom taste of bitterness, metallic and vile. He shook his head violently, as though the motion could fling away the images, but they stuck. The drink was no longer in the restaurant. It was inside him now, a ghost that had climbed into his bloodstream and made a home in his mind. For a long moment he closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the city wash over him. The hum of electricity, the distant blare of a horn, the faint rush of wind. He tried to ground himself in the present, to remind himself he had not taken a sip, that he was still alive. But the fear persisted, not of dying, but of knowing that his son wanted him to. That truth was harder to carry than the weight of poison itself. When he opened his eyes again, the fear had shifted. It was still there, coiled tight in his chest, but beneath it lay something colder, sharper. Fear could cripple a man, but it could also sharpen him, strip away illusions and leave behind a core of steel. Richard felt that steel forming now, forged in the fire of terror. He was still trembling, still breathless, but he was standing. He was alive, and being alive meant he had a choice. He pushed himself away from the wall, his stride slower now, but deliberate. The night stretched ahead, a path littered with questions darker than the shadows. If the glass had been his enemy tonight, what enemies waited in the days to come? If his son had already crossed the line into betrayal, how far would he go and how long before Richard would be forced to answer him in kind? The questions tore at him like claws he couldn't shake off. Why would his own son cross such a line? Was it greed, the oldest poison in the world, dripping into David's veins until family meant nothing? Was it hatred, festering beneath years of disappointment and silence, swelling until it erupted in a plot so cruel it could only end one way? Or was there someone else behind it, a voice whispering in his ear, nudging him down a path he might not have had the courage to walk alone? The possibilities crashed against Richard's mind in endless succession, each more vicious than the last. He turned a corner onto a quieter street where the shops had long since closed their windows dark, their mannequins staring blankly into the night. The stillness pressed in around him, and with it came the weight of uncertainty. The betrayal was already unbearable, but the not knowing, the endless swirl of possible motives, was a deeper torment. If it had been about money, Richard could almost understand. Greed had always been an ugly undercurrent visible in David's impatient glances when financial matters came up, in the sharp way he spoke when inheritance slipped into conversation. But hatred. That was a wound too deep to accept. Richard had never stopped providing, never stopped protecting. Could love itself curdle into something so toxic that a son could look at his father and see nothing but an obstacle to destroy? The idea clawed at him, sending his thoughts spiraling backward. He remembered arguments, words flung in anger, slammed doors that rattled the walls of their home. He remembered the cold shoulders, the clipped replies, the way David's eyes had hardened as he grew older, a wall building brick by brick between them. Was that wall now so thick that David could no longer see the man who had raised him? Only the man who stood in the way of something he wanted. Richard's steps slowed, his gaze drifting upward to the thin slice of moon caught between clouds. Linda's face surfaced in his mind, her warnings echoing in the night air. She had always seen further than he had, always sharper when it came to their son. "Don't let him grow careless with love," she had said once, her tone firm, her eyes unyielding. Richard had brushed it off, believing time would smooth out the rough edges, that discipline would harden into responsibility, that love would eventually bind the cracks. Now, under the weight of suspicion, her words cut sharper than ever. Perhaps it had not been discipline David had needed, but boundaries. And Richard, blinded by loyalty, had failed to draw them. But what if it wasn't just money or hatred or his own failures? What if someone else had fed the fire? He thought of the people orbiting David now, friends with hungry eyes, in-laws with polite but prying questions, strangers with business cards who spoke too smoothly about opportunities. It wouldn't take much for one of them to plant the seed, to whisper that the old man had lived long enough that his wealth and property could be put to better use. Richard could almost hear it, a silky voice dripping poison wrapping around his son's pride and insecurity, until betrayal seemed like logic instead of sin. The thought made his jaw tighten, fury rising beneath the confusion. If someone had pushed David, then David had let himself be pushed. He could not shift the blame entirely, not when his son had stood at that table, not when his son had poured what could have been death into a glass and left without remorse. Influence might explain, but it did not excuse. And Richard, standing alone in the chill of the night, knew that no matter the reason, money, hatred, or manipulation, the act itself was unforgivable. Still, the questions gnawed at him. If it was money, how much did David think his father's life was worth? A house, a bank account. If it was hatred, what was the breaking point that turned irritation into malice? And if it was someone else's influence who had been given the power to twist blood against blood, each question cracked open a deeper wound, each possibility heavier than the last, until Richard felt as though he were carrying the weight of betrayal on his shoulders, like a yoke designed to crush him. He stopped near a bench beneath a dying street lamp, lowering himself slowly, his knees stiff from years of labor. His hands rested on his thighs, but his mind spun without rest. He could almost see David's face shifting through the versions he had known: the laughing boy, the brooding teenager, the ambitious man. Each version blurred into the one he had seen tonight, cold, distant, unreadable. The memory of that face, paired with the untouched glass, tightened Richard's chest. How had it come to this? The night was silent except for the faint hum of electricity overhead, but inside his skull, the noise was deafening. He replayed conversations he had dismissed at the time, David pressing him about selling the house, asking about bank accounts, remarking with a strange flatness about how tired Richard looked. Hints Richard realized now that he had ignored in the name of trust. Had every moment been a rehearsal, every word a step toward tonight? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and closed his eyes. The questions spiraled tighter, suffocating. He needed answers, but answers would not come from speculation. They would only come from truth, and truth would have to be pried from the shadows David had wrapped himself in. Richard exhaled slowly, forcing calm into his lungs. He could not unravel this storm in one night, but he could begin. He had already seen enough to know the danger was real, that the bond he once believed unbreakable had been weaponized against him. When he opened his eyes, the fear was still there, sharp and jagged, but beneath it burned something else, resolve. The questions had not broken him. They had sharpened him, and as he rose from the bench, his shadow stretching long across the pavement, Richard knew the search for answers had already begun. What he didn't know yet, but would soon discover, was that the truth waiting for him was far darker than even his worst suspicions. The silence had been the loudest sound of the night. It wasn't the clatter of forks or the faint melody from the piano tucked into the corner of the restaurant that haunted Richard. It was the absence of words, the hollow vacuum left in the wake of his son's departure. That silence pressed against his chest heavier than any noise could have been. He sat there alone, staring at the flickering candle in the middle of the table, feeling its glow falter with every passing second, as though even the flame could sense the weight of abandonment settling in around him. The room had shifted after David left. Conversations at other tables seemed to grow distant, blurred at the edges, though Richard could still make out bursts of laughter, the clinking of glasses, the hum of a life he no longer felt part of. Every sound only emphasized his isolation. The air seemed thicker, harder to breathe, as if the walls of the restaurant had leaned closer, compressing the space until he was nothing more than a man trapped in a glass box, visible to all but understood by none. His lips remained sealed not because he had nothing to say, but because no words could survive the storm inside him. Rage, sorrow, disbelief, and an aching loneliness collided beneath his ribs, each one demanding space, each one battling to be heard. But his mouth stayed closed, his face a mask, his silence a shield. He knew if he spoke, if he gave voice to even one thought, the dam would break and there would be no stopping what poured out. Around him, the staff moved with professional politeness. Plates were carried past him. Drinks refilled, a cake lit with sparklers delivered to a family 3 tables away. The room applauded, voices raised in joy, but to Richard it was a cruel spectacle. He watched as a father held his child close, the boy grinning with pride as the flames sputtered in front of him. The sight drove a knife deeper into Richard's chest, a reminder of what once had been his, and what had now curdled into something unrecognizable. The silence inside him grew louder. He could hear his own heartbeat, steady but strained, echoing like a drum in an empty hall. He looked at the glass of juice still on the table, untouched, glowing faintly beneath the dim lights. It seemed to throb with menace, a symbol of everything broken, of everything that had turned against him. He couldn't bring himself to touch it, but he couldn't look away either. It was the embodiment of his pain, a reminder that love had been twisted into something sharp enough to cut him open. He tried to sit straighter, to summon the strength of the man he had once been, the father who had carried burdens silently and endured every storm. But tonight felt different. Tonight, silence wasn't endurance. Tonight, silence was surrender. He clenched his hands on the tablecloth, his knuckles whitening, trying to stop the trembling. He knew eyes were on him, strangers curious about the solitary old man left alone on his birthday, but he refused to let them see the cracks forming beneath his skin. The minutes stretched into something unbearable, time bending beneath the weight of his solitude. Every tick of the clock above the bar felt like another reminder of absence. He thought of Linda again, of how she would have leaned over, placed her hand on his whispered strength into him. Without her, the silence was merciless. It was not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of abandonment, the quiet that follows when love has left the room. Richard lifted his gaze to the entrance, half expecting David to return to storm in with an excuse, even a lie, anything that might break the silence strangling him. But the doorway stayed empty, the night air drifting in with every swing of the door as strangers came and went. His son did not return. The silence answered him clearer than words ever could. He had been left not forgotten, but dismissed. The candle in the center finally sputtered out, a thin thread of smoke rising and vanishing. It mirrored him too perfectly, a flame reduced to nothing, its warmth stolen, its light consumed. The sight hardened something inside him. The silence, once unbearable, began to shift. It no longer felt like a void pressing him down, but like a forge heating him, reshaping him into something colder, stronger. He stood slowly, pushing back his chair with a scrape that cut through the restaurant's noise. For a moment, heads turned, eyes following him as he placed money on the table and left the untouched glass behind. He did not speak, did not acknowledge the curious glances. The silence remained his companion, following him out the door into the cool bite of the night air. Outside, the city pulsed with life, but to Richard it was muted, distant, like a film playing behind thick glass. He walked through it as if detached, the weight of solitude pressing against him with every step. Yet within that weight was something new, a seed planted by silence itself. It whispered that if love could betray, if family could abandon, then the only voice he could trust was the one forged in his own chest. The silence, once suffocating, began to feel like a weapon, a dangerous, patient weapon. And as Richard moved deeper into the night, his mind sharpened by the storm within, one thought followed him relentlessly. Silence might be deadly, but in his hands it could also become the sharpest revenge. The night pressed close as Richard walked, his shadow stretching long and thin beneath the fractured glow of street lamps. The silence clung to him, no longer the silence of helplessness, but something colder, heavier, like a cloak he had chosen to wear. Every step away from that restaurant pulled him deeper into the realization that what had happened was not a cruel misunderstanding, not a single act of thoughtless neglect. It was something calculated, deliberate, and poisonous in every sense of the word. His birthday had been the stage, the glass of juice the prop, and he the intended casualty. What lingered in his chest now was not just hurt, but an awakening, a merciless clarity that stripped him raw and rebuilt him in the same breath. He had thought the betrayal unbearable, the loneliness suffocating. But this was more than betrayal. This was revelation. A truth he had ignored for too long had now risen undeniable, roaring in the quiet of his mind. His son was not the boy he remembered, not the man he had once hoped would carry on the better parts of him. David had become something else, someone who could look at his own father and see only an obstacle, someone willing to lace love with venom. The knowledge chilled Richard to his marrow, but within that chill pulsed a certainty. This was no longer about surviving disappointment. This was about survival itself. He slowed his pace, stopping at the edge of a deserted park where the swings creaked faintly in the wind. He stood there, the echoes of children's laughter from years past bleeding into the night, and felt the sharp sting of irony. How many afternoons had he brought David here, pushing him higher, listening to his giggles fill the air, believing the bond between them was unbreakable. That same park now stood empty, shadows stretching across rusted chains, a graveyard of memories that mocked him with their innocence. The contrast bit deep, reminding him how far things had fallen. His breath curled white in the cold air as he tilted his head back to the sky. The moon stared down like an unblinking eye, silver and merciless, illuminating truths he could no longer turn from. He felt a tremor inside, not of fear this time, but of resolve hardening. He could not go back, could not unhear the warning or unknow the betrayal. The life he had lived until tonight, with its fragile threads of trust and its stubborn clinging to family loyalty, had ended with that untouched glass. Something inside him shifted. The weight of sorrow and disbelief settled into a new shape, determination. If his son believed him weak, if David thought he could erase him quietly and claim whatever he wanted, then the boy had underestimated the man who had built everything from nothing. Richard's silence would no longer be a mark of submission. It would be his weapon, precise and devastating. He turned from the park, his eyes sharper now, his stride deliberate. Each corner of the city seemed to whisper reminders: the restaurant, where he had nearly been undone; the shadowed alley, where he had nearly drowned in questions; the shuttered shops where he had seen his reflection, hollowed by grief. All of it converged into a single undeniable truth. Tonight had been a test, and he had walked away not as a victim, but as a man reborn in fire. The chill down his spine remained, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was a warning bell tolling loud within him, telling him that the time for illusions was over. He could not cling to hope that David would change, could not excuse cruelty as carelessness. The truth had to be faced, and once faced, it had to be acted upon. For the first time in years, Richard felt no hesitation about what must come next. He would uncover every motive, every influence, every hidden hand behind his son's actions. He would not just survive, he would expose. The decision settled into him like steel poured into a mold. His heart beat steady, no longer erratic with fear, but measured, deliberate, each thud a reminder that he was alive, that he still had choices to make. And with that heartbeat came a vow: David would learn what it meant to underestimate the father he had tried to erase. The betrayal would not be buried. It would be dragged into the light, no matter how painful, no matter how dangerous. Richard walked on his figure, cutting through the night with the gravity of a man who had crossed a threshold. The street stretched ahead, endless and uncertain, but he no longer felt small against its shadows. He carried the storm inside him, and with it the clarity that tonight was more than a birthday gone wrong. It was the hinge of his life, the moment when everything he had believed collapsed, and something stronger rose in its place. He had been broken, yes, but from those fractures came something unyielding. The truth had nearly killed him tonight, hidden in a glass meant to end him quietly. But instead of drinking, he had swallowed the lesson whole, and that lesson would guide every step forward. As he disappeared into the dark, the city lights fading behind him, one thought drove him harder than the rest. This was no longer about love or forgiveness. This was about truth. And the truth, once uncovered, would change everything. Trust is the foundation of every relationship. But Richard's story is a harsh reminder that even the deepest bonds can fracture when loyalty is replaced by greed or neglect. For older adults, it carries a warning we cannot ignore. Never assume silence equals safety, and never dismiss the small signals that something isn't right. Protecting what you've built over a lifetime, your health, your independence, your dignity, means being alert, setting boundaries, and refusing to let others take advantage of your kindness. It also means accepting that love does not excuse betrayal, and sometimes the most powerful act of love for yourself is to open your eyes and confront the truth, no matter how painful. Richard's pain is one many can relate to, but his determination is what transforms his suffering into strength. His story teaches us that awareness is protection, and that wisdom sharpened by experience can become the strongest weapon we carry into our later years. If this lesson resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that honor resilience, dignity, and the justice every parent deserves.